Welcome to The West Steps, a podcast about policy and advocacy. I'm your guest host today, Tara Manthe with the Colorado Children's Campaign. And we're turning the tables today so that I can interview your regular host, Beza Tades of the Children's Campaign, as part of our live studio audience recording for the Communications Network Denver chapter, meeting about podcasting for social change. So we have our audience in here. Good morning. You can hear them hopefully on the tape. We are excited to host everyone here today to learn a little bit more about the journey the Children's Campaign started on about a year ago, to really dive into a new medium for communicating with our audiences, policymakers, stakeholders about the issues facing kids. And I'm excited to interview the brains behind this achievement today, who you usually hear on this episode, on this podcast, but not very much of her voice is heard because she's doing all the interviewing. So good morning, Beza.
Good morning.
I wanted to start this morning really diving into the first nugget or idea or inkling that you had in thinking we should do a podcast. Where did that start and how did that evolve?
Well, it started because I noticed my own media consumption. I was spending a lot more time listening to podcasts than people I know were spending a lot of time listening to podcasts. And I got interested if this was like an individual pattern for me or if this was a shift in the media space. And I ended up reading a lot of research papers around how people, especially young people, and how they're consuming media was significantly changing. And one of the most exciting opportunities that I found was that more and more people were spending time listening to podcasts and they were either reading newspapers or to some extent even watching videos. So that led me to think about how the nonprofit sector is always kind of few steps behind the changes in media, and how as we think about involving more people into the advocacy space, we needed to meet them where they were. If they were spending so much time on podcasts, so we needed to meet them there. So I started doing a little bit more research, and from the initial digging I was doing, it looked incredibly intimidating. It was a lot of white bros in their basements, and and it felt almost like if you didn't have something controversial to say, you wouldn't have a podcast. So I wanted to kind of flip that onto the head and see, like everything else, this could be used for advocacy efforts. So, and that was when I started to bring in the idea around some of the stuff, and then to you later. And then you were like, if you want to do this, I'm not going to stop you, but also I don't know what this is about. So go for
it. That's accurate. And so I want to share with everyone that Beza listens to probably thousands of hours of podcasts.
It's true.
Per week. I don't know how you do it all, but she really had a good sense of what we should be talking about and what we shouldn't be talking about. And so one of the earliest kind of decisions that she made really, or advised us all to make, was not make this about kids' issues. We're at the Colorado Children's Campaign. We've worked on kids' issues for 35 years. And why do you think that was the road we should have taken?
So one thing I noticed in literally consuming thousands of hours of podcasts was that people were, even I was feeling that like I could listen to issues if they were connected to some kind of value system. Specific topics weren't necessarily interesting. The podcasts that I could talk about with anybody and everybody were podcasts that talked about values, that talked about kind of the larger picture, that you weren't by yourself, even though you are fundamentally blocking yourself from the world, putting headphones in and listening. It felt like the podcast that had bigger themes or that were tackling larger issues were a lot more connecting to people. So I, very earlier on, I found out that if we labeled the podcast something about kids, or if our tagline was something about kids, it fundamentally said that this is a space that you shouldn't get involved in. there's a way to bring in kids' issues without alienating a large group of people who felt like they had nothing to contribute or learn about because they weren't parents. So I wanted to start from kind of that like really large view of value-based communications and then connect it to people very slowly why in every value system we talk about, kids were a key ingredient. And that way, then you expand your kind of larger audience, but you also connect your base to a lot more values than you normally would that would activate them into actual actions. So I wasn't just interested in expanding the audience base, but I was also interested in those who are committed to the cause and who subscribe to our newsletters or came to our events. They can then go into one step further and take action. They're not just like kind of bystanders. So that's the route that I wanted to take.
And how do you think it went?
I think really well, because some of the most encouraging feedbacks that I got were from people who never heard of advocacy, never heard of policy making to this extent, and saying, I had no idea this is how our state government made its budget. I got an email, I think this is like the biggest bragging point for me, an email from an older lady who talked about how she was born and lived in Colorado all her life, and she had not once somebody explained to her how the state policy makes its annual budget and what that process was like. So that's what I'm interested in, because I think once you break that barrier to entry, then it's a lot easier conversation to talk about why you should go over to the state capitol and tell them what's important to you.
And let's talk a little bit about, we'll get into some of the more logistics and technical stuff at the end, but I wanted to talk a little bit about how you came up with topics that fit into that big framework of connecting with values, how you chose your guests, and some of the more surprising episodes that you've had successful, and we'll talk about failures at the end too.
Sure. So I chose topics based on that larger point that I was making at, like what is the value system? So I thought a lot about, especially the first season, I wanted people to understand public policy making. I wanted people to really have a full picture of how state government works. And when you kind of take on that huge charge, you have to think very strategically from who is the best speaker and what issues will retain more people in kind of this opening the doors for how public policy works. So I thought about kind of large camps of health, early childhood, K-12, family economic security, housing, food security. But then I wanted to also figure out how the Children's Campaign as a nonprofit is a policy changer. So how does our work fit into this idea of how government works? So I chose guests who can speak eloquently on how government works and how specific policy connects to individual people's lives and how people can get involved. So the first episode we did was about how public policy works, introduction 101 to how state government works. And we have a staff of pretty incredible people who know their issue area really well and can speak to it like humans. It's very interesting to listen.
I've read a lot of what they write, and I wouldn't say that.
Yes, exactly.
They write like humans because I've edited a lot of their.
Yes,
and I love them, and they love me, so they know I would say that. But talking was a whole different approach.
Yeah, so that was also one of the best things about podcasting is that I think when we sit down try to write about a specific policy, we tend to go in this very academic, this kind of white paper style. And when you're talking, if you say something I don't understand, I'm going to say, I don't understand what you're talking about. Can you just say that in people's language? And I think that then breaks that kind of shield of like these ways of communicating that alienates a lot of people if you're not in the know. So it gave a lot of people ways to explain the work that they're doing without kind of like hiding behind these really like technical terms to explain like real life situations, right? Like full day kindergarten is a real problem, but you could talk about it in a way that alienates a lot of people, even if they experience some of those barriers. So I found it a lot easier for people to talk about these things when it was just face to face to somebody. And so I chose topics that kind of advance that larger goal, but also can connect to what was happening. So it's very important when choosing a topic that if there is something major going on and you don't address it, the audience is kind of waiting. So I listen to a lot of political podcasts, as one would expect. And if there's something happening in the zeitgeist and the people don't talk about it, I'm like, okay, I have now less trust for you because you don't know what's happening. So I think there is a way to make use of kind of the frustration people feel, the kind of out of touch they think the media feels, and use it to their advantage to bring people in. So when the census fight was happening, I had somebody talk about the census. When Colorado was trying to pass the largest expansive legislation around full day kindergarten, we had people talk about that. And when we were talking about the mistreatment of young kids in classrooms in suspension and expulsion, we had an expert come and talk about that. So I think using what's happening in the zeitgeist to advance your policy work is a great way to think about who to choose and how to select guests. But also I think is sometimes you have to have the courage to say this issue is important, even if what's happening doesn't allow me to have this conversation. So in the activist circle, there was a lot of work for a long time, especially by Black women, around maternal mortality. And there wasn't a national conversation that's happening. So I could have just said, oh, that conversation is not happening in the zeitgeist. I don't need to have it. But I know what I'm trying to achieve at the end of the day in terms of policymaking. So I had people talk about on, I think, 3 episodes about maternal mortality. And those are some of the highest listener episodes because people felt connected to the problem, not just what's happening in the zeitgeist. So I think they're like multiple things, and you have to be incredibly flexible with people's schedules, your schedule, what's happening. So I think that multiple things come at the same time to help you choose guests and topics.
That's a great segue into some of the logistics of this. Oh, well, first I wanted to ask kind of like, what was your favorite episode and why, what made it good in your mind? And then we'll start with that.
Okay.
I like to like roll out all the questions at once. I'm so excited.
I think my favorite episode is the long bill episode. So we did an episode about the long bill, and
which is what?
Which is the budgeting process at the Colorado General Assembly. And I was very apprehensive about doing that episode because I personally would enjoy that. And I kept thinking about, would the audience want to know why 6 people make all the decision when it comes to how Colorado spends its money? And that episode ended up being the one that most people come to me about. We were doing a race training a couple of weeks ago for a Race Colorado Coalition, and I was in the bathroom stall, and I had 2 women. They were washing their hands, and they were talking about, did you think that was the West Steps lady? I heard the long bill. And I was like, oh my God, this is what fame looks like. It was pretty great to hear. You know, I think I spend a lot of time in creating these episodes that I think people would benefit from and would people get interested in. And the episodes that people tend to talk about and tend to email me about are the ones that I'm like, this is deeply technical. I bet 2 people will listen. So the long bill episode was my favorite one.
And it had a lot of listens.
It had a lot of
That's
listens.
surprising. And everyone, we were like, wow,
this
amazing.
is how it works. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the interesting things is we can see from the data in the back end how many people listen to an episode all the way through.
Yeah.
And we try to keep them about 20 minutes. So they're, some podcasts are like hour and a half and you're like, I got to get on with my life. But we wanted to keep it about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's a long time to talk about one topic. And it's a long time for someone to listen. What do you think's happening that they're listening all the way through? And if you think like, if you wrote an article, pretty technical article about the long bill and it was 20 minutes long read, I don't think many people would get all the way through, but they got through this. What do you think is going on there?
So a couple of things. We don't try to get into the weeds to show the expertise of the speaker. I think a lot of times people get lost in the idea that if you want the audience to trust you, you have to show them you're an expert. That's not true. Once they trust the host of the podcast, they assume the host would only bring somebody who knows what they're talking about. So you don't have to consistently think about, oh, I have to make the audience trust me every episode. I think you established that very earlier on. So you kind of let the speaker stay at that kind of high level because, sorry for the experts in the room, but most people do not care what you're doing in terms of the technical things. They want to know what the problem is, what you're trying to solve, and how they can be a part of it. And keeping it at that level gets people, like they don't have to go do a 20-minute research on a specific thing you just mentioned. The thing is to not show that the podcast, the purpose isn't to establish you as an expert. The purpose is to explain the problem and what's being done about it. So that keeps it at that level where the entry to understanding is very low. And also, I think it's speaking in a way you would speak to a person. Like, if you were sitting across from somebody and they were explaining something to you, and all of a sudden they go into this like presentation mode and they're just talking at you, you wouldn't want to be in that conversation. I would walk away. So I think it's like keeping it conversational. And I consistently ask questions based on what they say. So I usually prep 4 questions: what the problem is, what is the children's campaign or its partners doing about it, and something about how people can get involved. And the first is usually an introduction to that person's who they are and why they're there. And then throughout the episode, I ask questions from a person who has no idea what the topic is. I spend a lot of time reading about the topics ahead of time because you kind of have to know what the topic is to ask questions as if you didn't know what the topic was. I know that kind of is a little confusing. So I ask a question as if I've never seen that information before. That way, then you want to keep listening because the questions that pop in your head are the questions that I'm asking.
And that really aligns with one of our goals as communicators here at the campaign in the last several years is really connecting the dots for people so they don't use their implicit bias, their background information, or just past experience to make assumptions about people based on their race, ethnicity, ability, all of those factors. And this was one way that we could really help bring people along in a conversational way to help connect those dots where we had been missing that mark in the past, don't you think?
Yeah, I think there is a way in writing. There's a way of talking that is almost assumes a lot about the reader. And there's a lot of black boxes that are left unchecked that perpetuate a lot of stereotypes, a lot of systems of oppression. And when you're talking, it's a lot harder to do that. I can't just say like, you
can't
know,
even do it because
I can't, you know, like it's just, it's a lot harder to not see people for the complication than they are when you're talking. It's a lot easier to do that in writing. I think like you could make the case for why like some forms of communications are a little bit more intuitive than others. I think writing requires, like, to do it well, to do it effectively for advocacy requires a lot of work. Whereas speaking, to do it really well, I don't think it requires as much work as writing. I think that's why like Twitter is a death trap. But
she spends a lot of time on Twitter. Let me go backtrack a little bit. What does the West Steps mean? And especially since we may have some listeners from outside of Colorado, they may not be as familiar with our
a lot of listeners in California. The West Steps. So I wanted people to really get the staff to get really invested in the podcast. So we actually did a brainstorming for the naming of the podcast. And the way I explained the podcast was it's explaining what's happening at the state government in a way that makes people want to get involved in their government. And one of our staff members, who's one of the most creative people, came up with the West Steps. The West Steps at the Colorado State Capitol is where a lot of advocacy happens. It doesn't belong to the policymakers. It belongs to the advocates. That's where all the rallies are held. That's where people go to make a noise about things that are important to them. So I wanted that kind of inside-outside conversation. And so, the policymakers are hopefully held accountable on the West Steps, and government is explained to people on the West Steps. So that's kind of...
And that was one of your hardest decisions.
Yes.
Hardest points in this whole process was coming up with a good name. And why is that important in this world?
Because we give very little attention to anything that doesn't get our attention in the first place. So we spent a lot of time designing our logo and making sure that explains who we are and what we do. And the name is an extension to that. I think like you want people curious enough to listen to it, but you also want people to not be intimidated by it. If I like called it the policy advocacy conversation or something like that, I already put words in there that requires a higher barrier to entry.
Okay, so that was one of the hardest decisions or points in it. What else was a barrier for you? What else was difficult?
I think the first, saying like, oh, okay, I now know enough to just record the first episode was a lot. I wanted to start as soon as the legislative session started because I wanted to do an episode every week of the legislative session and have the first season end at the end of the legislative session and do bonus episodes throughout the summer and the winter. I think that it took a lot for me to say, okay, I've done the research for 6 and 7 months. I know the softwares I'm using. I know the equipment that I'm using. I know how to mix this. I know how to edit this. I know how to produce this. And especially when you read about how, podcasting studios have about 10 people working on one podcast, you're like, there is no way I can do this. And I think that it could only get better as you go on. So I'm just saying, you know what? If this one is terrible, it's going to be fine. I
think I said a few times, no one's going to listen to this. So it's fine.
Not true because 100 people listened to the first episode within the first 2 weeks. And I was like, oh my God, the world's coming to an end. So I think it's just like, once you do the work of researching, figuring out exactly what you want to do, kind of the larger theme, not just in each episode, but you have a goal for the overall purpose of the podcast. Because I think you can listen to a lot of podcasts that don't have any kind of mission or goal. And you hear it in each episode because they are very disconnected. They don't have a theme. And the ones that you want to go back to are the ones that you feel like they have a purpose in your life.
You have to hear what's next.
Yeah. And if you're giving me 20 minutes of your time, I want to make sure that you're connected to something larger. After you've done that work, is to just say, you know what? If some 22-year-old out of his mom's basement can do it, I can do it.
And so at one point, I think as communicators who spend a lot of years polishing how we write, how we present, all of these things, this was really put us in a vulnerable spot to not be as polished, to not be as perfectionist as we would have wanted. And at a certain point, we had a deadline and we just had to record an episode and edit it and put it out there.
Yep.
And that was really the best way to do it.
Yeah, we just put a story in Kids Flash that said the West Steps coming next week, so I could record it.
And the Kids Flash is our weekly e-newsletter, which we really the only promotion we've done for the West Steps is through our newsletter and social media channels. And we, I listen to each episode and write a little blurb for the host site, and that gets fed into the, Spotify, iTunes, podcast, that kind of thing. And then we kind of push it out through our e-newsletter and through our social media. And that worked pretty well for our first season.
Yep. So the first season, I think I wanted to see how it would do organically, because I think there's a lot you can change about how people get interested in it if you paid for ads or if you used other mediums to advertise it. So I wanted to see how it would do organically if there was an actual interest. Like if I wasn't paying ads and putting it in front of everybody, would like people who normally follow our information follow it. And because I think then you can make a lot of case for why this should go on or why it should be a longer season or whatever the case is. So we just wanted to see how it does on its own. And that's what we did for the first season.
And what's next for promotion in your, in what you would like to do if we could get funding for it?
Yeah. So I think after doing it one season, it would be, my goal is to be a little bit more strategic about its marketing. And obviously, you could always get better equipment. To get better equipment, you kind of have to put it in front of more people to justify the cost of the equipment. So I think I want to do a little bit more polished intros and outros. I want to do a little bit more in-depth conversations with people who are just not on our staff. And we had a couple of experts last season, but I want to do more of that and talk to more legislators. I think there's a lot of unmasking of how we understand legislators that need to be done in order to get people involved in policymaking. So that's kind of the bigger picture.
And we also want to spend a little bit more money pushing it out, doing some marketing, buying ads in social media and digital spaces to help get that in front of people who may not encounter it otherwise. So another goal. One last question for you, and then I'll invite anybody who wants to ask a question, make your way up here, and we will very smoothly switch desks, seats without bumping any of this equipment. Speaking of the equipment, describe for people who are listening, especially, and our audience, what is going on here? What do we have?
So we have one of the cheapest mics you can find. We have two of them. And then because they're not incredible high quality mics, I've gotten this relatively cheaper screens. In a kind of perfect world scenario, you would have a mic that only records the audio that's coming from one direction instead of picking up all the audio from around it. So the screen helps focus the audio that it's recording. But you probably have seen a white dude with big microphone and headphones, and you see the mics usually have a lot of cushion around it, and that's to prevent from the surround system being picked up by the audio, because there's not any amount of editing you can do if you record an audio and it has picked up a lot of outside voice.
Pause there and tell us what has happened in our office while recording.
I think there is something magical that happens in the air where when you say, I'm recording, everybody gets on the phone. There's I think a message that goes out to everybody's inbox that says, please slam your doors. So we ended up doing kind of the very high-tech warning signs that you could see here. That tells people.
We have a traffic cone sitting here, but we also put it in the middle of the hall to alert people that recording's in session.
Yep. And also I think that I didn't think this would make a difference, but I started sending emails to the staff that said, we're recording, it only takes 30 minutes. Please keep it down. And that usually helps. So I think you kind of learn to see, sometimes you just can't help it. Like you hear the microwave go off and you're like, well, people are making lunch. Maybe I should schedule my recordings at 10 a.m. So I think it's because in a perfect world, you have a recording studio, right? You would go pay for a recording studio. But recording studios per session are really expensive. And as a nonprofit, I cannot go to Tara and say, hey, I'm recording once a week for 3 months and I need $120 for 20 minutes. It just does not make sense. So I think it's like you figure out, like I have curtains in my office and I like drape tablecloths everywhere to prevent surfaces from reflecting sound onto my mics. So like there are small tricks like that you do when you're recording in your office. People record in closets. That's a lot harder to do when you're interviewing somebody. So I think it's like I think it's a learning process. Like the first episode and the last episode, the sound quality is totally different. So you just kind of take it one episode at a time. Yeah. And
then the other equipment we have here are some arms that kind of hold the mic off the table so there's not as much bumping, because every little bump is like a in their audio. And they look like little cranes.
Yep. And it's very interesting because our policy staff talks with their hands. I think it's a very
lot of this.
And so there's I had this without the stands. I had just the mics that like on their own stands on like a stack of books in front of them. There was a lot of banging that was happening and they like don't realize I can hear it. So I can hear like boom. And so that would just needed to be like, you can't tell people to not use their arms if they're like used to talking this way. So we just got stands that make it a lot easier for people to just feel comfortable, that they're not paying attention to like not hitting the table.
It also makes it look more legit. Like
I guess
is a total legit thing. And then what is this? There's only a few pieces of equipment. It looks like a lot, but there's just a computer, mics, the arms, and then we have a red box in the middle. What is this?
So that's a mixer. So when you're doing interviews, you can record each voice on a separate track and then mix them. That's just you spending way too much time in the editing and production if you're doing that. So the cheapest way to do that is get something like a mixer that allows you to control both audio files and record on the same track. So this whole thing is a multi-track recording session. So you could technically record in a 2 mono-track recording sessions and then mix them. But then you have to figure out which question goes which answer. And then there's a lag or no lag. And if there's a lag, you have to cut and paste audio. I did that on my first episode. And for a 20-minute episode, 25 minutes, I think the first one was, I ended up editing for about 7 hours. That's just the waste of time. And I have other jobs. So I have other responsibilities in my job. So I did a little bit more research. And then once we got the mixer, it's a lot easier to record in a multi-track, and Adobe Audition already comes with a template for a podcast, and if you have a mixer, it's just a lot easier.
And we got all of this on Amazon, and it was just a lot of recommendations from other podcast hosts who had put out lists of good stuff to buy.
Yeah, and I know I said earlier Twitter is a hellhole, but
love-hate thing.
But I've ended up contacting one of the production. Do you guys know Today Explained from Vox Media? So there's a podcast from Vox Media, and the producer for Vox Media's Today Explained is a guy that I really admire, and I think he just does really cool things with that podcast. It's a daily explainer. So I just like DM'd him on Twitter, and I was like, hey, like, do you have any advice? And he like till this day emails me being like, hey, this is what I'm doing differently. And I think it's just like, as intimidating as it is, I'll be like, why would a guy from Vox Media email me back about microphone recommendations? I was just like, hey, I'm doing this thing. I don't have formal training. I literally YouTube this stuff. Like, do you have any advice? And he gave me a lot of recommendations for the mixer, the softwares that I use.
And what is that software?
So I use Adobe Audition. And then we also do, we'll talk about this.
The hosting.
The hosting. And we have a hosting company, Buzzsprout, that he recommended that
Buzzsprout.
Yeah, that allowed us to. So once you record your podcast, you have to put it somewhere so all the other podcasts hosting apps know where to find your podcasts. So that when somebody goes into their Apple podcast app and type in the West Steps, it comes up. So there has to be a place where you put your podcast, and so other distributors is the best way to explain them. So like Spotify, for example, can find them. You can't go and give it to Spotify, give it to Stitcher, give it to SSR. Like that's just a lot of work. So you have a hosting company, and that hosting company is also the one that allows you to see, who's listening, where are they listening from, the data part of it. It's like, it's just a lot easier that way. So he recommended a few of them, and I did a bunch of research, and this one is the reliable one with cost. It's also cost effective.
And so with hosting, software, and equipment, we've probably spent, I don't remember, 500.
Yeah, so
500 bucks.
I would say something like that. Yeah,
not expensive.
Not expensive.
Totally doable.
So the hosting company is about $18 a month, and the equipment's a one-time investment. So once you make it, like that, you have that. In terms of the cost to benefit ratio, I think it's pretty worth it.
Just a lot of time.
Yeah.
Raise your hand if you have a question. All right, come on up. And I'm going to hop out of the way. We're going to take a few questions and then wrap up.
Yeah.
So please introduce yourself and ask your question. And I'm going to get up and let you sit down without having dead air.
Dead air is fine. You can cut it. Hi.
Hi there. I'm Zach Hockstad. I'm one of the founding partners at Mission Minded. We're a branding firm that works with nonprofit organizations.
Okay.
I'm really curious about some of the logistics in terms of your time. Do you have other job responsibilities? How often are you producing an episode? How long does it take you to prep for it, to record it, to edit it, and make it live?
Yeah, so I do have a lot of other job responsibilities. This is one I took on, and Tara said, sure, go for it, and it ended up being a big part of my job. So I think the initial process of figuring out how this works, learning your own patterns of like how much prep time you need compared to how much editing time you need, that takes a lot of time investment. But I think once you figure it out, so I have done one season and few bonus episodes now, that I know exactly how long it takes me to record, how long it takes me to edit, produce, and then make it live. The prep time depends on the issue. So for example, I'm currently prepping for an episode about school safety and gun violence. That requires a lot of reading because it's a very sensitive topic, and I need to be able to know where the pitfalls are before I can comfortably have that conversation with somebody else. But I have another episode that I'm recording this Friday about an update on the maternal mortality subcommittee that just got into law this session. That does not require a lot of prep time. I would say about 45 minutes to an hour. So I think it really depends on the topic. But I would say, like, if you want to make this investment into your organization, the amount of prep time and kind of figuring all of it out, all of that cost kind of comes at the beginning. And once you figure it out, it's just flows, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So hello, how are you?
Very
I am
good.
Rosanna Longo Better, and I am going to start working tomorrow in KGNU Community Radio as the new bilingual reporter producer, and it's a
Wow.
big job. And I'm like, oh my gosh,
You got this.
what? what am I going to do? So I do have a question for you. Have you done interviews outside your office? Have you run out into these noisy places where you really get the voices of those that are experiencing either, the problems or the situations, or they are fighting or protesting?
Yep. So I did an episode about Speak Up for Kids Day. It's an advocacy day at the state capitol. About 120 people attend from all around the state. And I wanted the listeners to understand that in order to be actively participating in advocacy, you don't need to have a lot of training or anything like that. So I wanted to talk to people as they were experiencing this advocacy day. So, and I talked to state legislators and things like that at the state capitol. There's just a lot of noise. And when you have 120 people and you're trying to talk to somebody, there are people talking all the time. So I think a couple of things that I've found is that if you have an iPhone, the voice memo on that, coupling that with a small mic works really, really well. So I would have like a small mic, and I would use my voice memo, and that way I get like not a crisp audio per se, but you get an audio that require less manipulating. And also I think that when you're doing field work like that, when you're going out there and talking to people, I also did one for our statewide network. When you kind of want people to know there's a lot happening on there. So like, I think it's like sometimes you can fight the noise, or you can use it towards the story that you're telling. And the other thing to do is that in the I found useful is that in the audios that you find that there's a lot of background noise, and you find that it might not be useful in the story that you're telling, one thing you could do is that you can then go back to your studio or your office, record, kind of put it in context so that it doesn't feel like it doesn't take away from the story. So, for example, I interviewed these young high schoolers who wanted to come and talk about full day kindergarten at their state legislator. And that was the first time talking about state policy and advocacy. And it's like great story especially for adults to hear that, oh, kids can do it too. But I needed to put it in context. These are children from high school, because when I asked them a question, they didn't necessarily introduce themselves in a way that gave a backstory. So to go back into the studio and put those kind of noisy audios into context really helps tell the story. Does that help? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah.
That's the second question, really quickly. Have you done videotaping also that go along with your podcasting?
Yeah, so I do a weekly what happened at the state capitol wrap up, a video that's not that's not the same as the podcast itself, but it gives our supporters like a weekly 2-3 minute video of what's happening at the state capitol. So it's kind of, it goes with it, but it's not like one and the same. So sometimes we talk about food security on the podcast. I usually do the videos with our government affairs director, Riley. He's the one who does them with me. I make him plug the podcast in there, who would say, this week on the West Step, we're talking about this. Make sure you tune in, something like that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Rebecca Saltman, and I'm a social entrepreneur working on large-scale impact projects. And I'm wondering, if you were to start a brand new, what would be the 3 first things that you would do?
I would get very clear about the goal. So there will be moments as you kind of take on this project that you're like, I can't look at any more editing software. I just can't do it. So keeping that goal very clear about the purpose of why you're doing this. Because I think that like, if you do a podcast for the sake of podcasting, I promise you it's not worth your time. But if you have a purpose of what you're trying to accomplish, that makes it easier. And the second thing is that I would give myself longer than I would have thought that I would need for that kind of research window, because I think that like rushing through that makes it harder than on the front end of things. So if you think you need 3 months to get this up and going, give yourself 6 months. I would do that. And the third thing I would do is that once I feel I'm ready, I would just pull the plug. I would just ready to go. I wouldn't keep up. One more week. I would just do it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Beza, for allowing me to interview you today. And we will be back shortly with Beza back in the host seat and much more comfortable being the one with the questions. So thank you all to our ComNet Denver audience for joining us here today.